We begin today the Gemara on Daf Pei Tes Amud Aleph, Tanu Rabbanan, 6 or 7 lines down from the top of the Yomud. Tanu Rabbanan, we learned in the Braise, Dayish. It says in the Torah the term of Dayish. This is referring to the pasuk where it says, Loi sachsem shor b'dishay, don't muzzle the ox when it's threshing. So it speaks specifically about dishay, when it threshes. Now here, the whole continuation of this Amud will be discussing this expression of by the threshing, the dayish, that it says by the animal, that you're not allowed to muzzle it. But from here, the Gemara will learn out, be'ikir b'nigei, to a worker, a person that's working, that you have to let him eat from the fruits when he works, and we'll learn from this term of dayish exactly when and what it is that you have to let him eat. Now, even though this pasuk is written regarding the animal, but before here on this Amud, the Gemara said that we compare the chaysim to the nechsam, which means we compare the animal and the person that is working with the animal, that they both have the same halacha. So therefore the Braise here learns from dayish regarding the halacha of a worker. So now we learn like this: Ma dayish miyuchad davar shegidulei karka, just like the threshing. This is specifically speaking about things that grow from the ground. So we're going to skip here the parentheses because the Braise later will discuss this separately. And a worker is allowed to eat from it. This means that a worker can eat only from when he's working in the field and he has a gedule karka. Yotza hachaylev, this excludes a person, a worker that's milking a cow, or v'hamachabitz, he takes the milk and he places it into the place where to create the cheese, v'hamagabin, and the one that actually makes the cheese. Shein gedule karka, these are all work that's not with things that are growing from the ground. Ve'ein payol eichel bay. So a worker cannot eat there. So the Gemara asks, why is it necessary to bring this drasha from the word dayish? Lomali, why do I need this drasha? Michisavai bekerem reyacha nafke. Don't I understand this from the lashon of the pasuk that it says by the worker himself? Over there it says when he comes into the vineyard. So it's speaking about gedule karka. And says the Gemara, itztrich, I need the drasha from dayish as well. So because I would think to say, besides kerem reyacha, as we brought before in Daf Peches, there's another pasuk where it says also kama, when a person comes into kisave bekamas reyacha. What does kama mean? Kama literally means the standing grain or the standing things that are in the field. But I would think maybe it means l'rabbis kol bale kama. Maybe it means anything that's standing in the field, which includes even animals that are walking and standing in a field and you're milking an animal. So I would say maybe it comes to say that it includes even things that are not growing from the ground. Kamash Malon, that's why we learn from dayish that it's only like the threshing, that's only with things that grew from the ground. Tanya Doch, and another Braise we learn what the dayish tells me. Dayish, ma dayish miyuchad, davar shebeshaz gemar malachtay poyel eichel bay. The dayish is when you're threshing, so then you're finishing the work with this kernels that it should become ready, prepared to use. So it's a work. Dayish threshing is a gemar malacha when you're finishing it, and then the poyel is allowed to eat like the animal. You're not allowed to muzzle. Av kol shu b'shaz gemar malacha poyel eichel bay. So you're only allowed to eat if it's at the time when you're finishing the work. Yotza, so this excludes hamanachish b'shumim or b'bitzalim, a person that is weeding the things that are still growing. You're not cutting them yet off. Shumim, bitzalim, whether it's garlic or onions. So since it's still attached to the ground and you're just doing work to improve their growth, the work is not done with it yet. You can't pluck anything and take for yourself and eat from it. So again, the Gemara asks on this, Lamali, why is it necessary to learn it out from what it says here, dayish? You could learn this out, as the Gemara before brought, that when the pasuk says that a work is allowed to eat, it says that that you're putting it into the keli for the balabas in his basket, so you can take and eat by hand, and you can't put it into your own basket. Don't gather for yourself in your own basket. So from that we understand that you're talking about a gemar malacha when you're cutting from the tree, not while it's still in the middle of growing. And says the Gemara that chiddush over here that we're learning out from the case of dayish is an additional point. Afal gav the kamashliv ketini mi beni alimi, that when a person has, let's say, onions that are growing, and he pulls out small onions from between the larger onions. He wants the larger onions to grow better and have room to grow better, so he pulls out some smaller onions, and that makes space for the larger onions to grow better. So in such a case, if it was just a pasuk of el kal yachal esitein, you would think that you could eat from it, because you're already plucking it, you're taking it out, and you're putting it into a keli, and you could think that you can go and eat it for yourself. So that's why it's telling you that you can't, because really what you're doing over here is not considered to be a gemar malacha. You're only taking out the small onions for the larger onions to grow better. So it's all for the purpose of the larger onions that are still in the middle of growing, that should grow better. Therefore, that's I learned from dayish that you can't eat from it. Tanya, in the third brayso we learned dayish. Well, the word dayish tells me another point. Ma dayish miyucha dava shaloi nigmara malachtai lemaiser payal echel boy. Just like dayish is something that when you're threshing, it's not yet, the malacha of it is not yet done, that you would be chayiv to separate meiser of it. So payal eichel boy, a payal can eat from it and until that, and when it's still in this state, before it's chayiv and meiser, he's allowed to eat from it. So too, I learned from here that until which point is the payal allowed to eat from it? So when it's picked from the tree, but until the point of, or when you cut the grain from the ground, until when? Until when it's not made into a pile, till when it's not prepared for meiser. He's allowed to eat from it. Now yotza, this would exclude by trees, habaydol betmarim or begreigeris, when you separate dates from each other or the figs from one another. So then it's already finished product and it's ready to be eaten. So that's a finished product from meiser. So at that point already, the worker, is not allowed to eat from it. So the Gemara asks on this, but Tanya, in another brayso we learned, habaydol bitmarim or begreigeris, a person that's doing this work with the dates and the figs, he separates the figs from one another or the dates from one another. This worker is allowed to eat from it. Rav Papa answers, Ki Tanyahi b'tuchloni. Over there, it's talking about these dates or these figs that they're not, even after he separates them, they're not ready to eat yet. Rashi says that these are tamarim roim. They're the dates and figs that are not, they don't ripen properly on the tree. And only afterwards, after you take them, you pick them from the tree, you separate them from one another, and you have to still wait for it to put it in a warm place for it to ripen, to be able to eat it. So therefore, even after you separate it, it's still not ripe enough to eat. So therefore, it's before it's chayiv and meiser, so the payal is still allowed to eat from it. Tanya doch, we learned in another brayso, fourth brayso, about what we learned from the term dayish. Dayish miyuchad dava shalei nigmara malachtei lechala. Dayish means, just like this refers to when you're threshing, this is something that it's not yet done, that it's not yet something that's chayiv in the mitzvah of challah. Challah is when you make a dough out of it, then you separate the challah. So payal echel boy, so the payal can eat from this grain. So too, anything that you're working with and it's not yet prepared and ready, that you would be chayiv to separate the challah from it, a payal is allowed to eat from it. Now yotza, halosh, this excludes someone that's kneading, or va'amekatif, or someone that's braiding, and he puts, let's say, the egg on the challah or on what he's braiding, or someone that's baking, shenigmara malachtei lechallah. Because at this point, it's already the dough that's chayiv and challah, the aim, payal eichel bay. So then the worker can't eat from it. Okay, so we had over here now two braises regarding the term dayish, the last two braises. When is something considered to be a finished product enough that at that point you say that the payal cannot eat from it? The first braise, it said when it's finished enough that it's ready to eat for meiser. And in the next braise we just had here, it says when it's finished enough that it's ready, that it's chayiv and challah. So the Gemara asks, it's a contradiction. Because it's already finished, you'd be chayiv and meiser. Even before you make it into a dough, as soon as it's miruach, which is when you create a pile of this grain that's ready then to be used to go and to grind it and to make flour out of it, it's already chayiv and meiser. So how could you say that he can eat from it until a much later point when you make a dough and it'd be chayiv and challah? And says the Gemara, it's two different situations. Loikashi, it's not a question. The chutzalaretz askinon, the brayso that says that you go according to the time when it becomes chayiv and challah, it's in chutzalaretz, the leke meiser. In chutzalaretz, since there's no obligation of meiser, so therefore over there you can't go according to the time that it would become chayiv and meiser to say that it's finished, that you can't eat from it anymore, but you go according to the time when it's chayiv and challah. So the Gemara asks on this, if it's in Chutz La'aretz, min haTeireh, there's no obligation of separating Chala and Chutz La'aretz as well. The whole obligation of Chala and Chutz La'aretz is only midrabanan. And here we're speaking about what it's considered to be a finished product by what it's chayev min haTeireh. So how could you say that we're talking about Chutz La'aretz and you follow the time of when it's chayev and Chala, if min haTeireh there's no chayev of Chala at all? Ella says the Gemara Lo'ilam Ba'aretz. It's speaking about in a field in Eretz Yisrael. And there's a difference in what time period. V'loi kashi, it's not a question. B'sheva shekivshu u'b'sheva shechilku, in the first 14 years, when the Yidden entered into Eretz Yisrael, and there were 7 years that they were conquering the land, and then another 7 years that they distributed and they divided the territory. In those 14 years, there was no chiyuv of meiser yet. There was only a chiyuv of chala. So it's in those 14 years that the Brisa says that you follow the time period of chala. And after that, though, even earlier, when as soon as it's chayiv and meiser, the worker can't eat it from it anymore. The master said, those 40 years that the Yidden conquered and divided the territory, they were already chayiv in the mitzvah of chala, but they weren't obligated to separate meiser yet. But the Gemara doesn't accept this answer either. The Gemara asks, but midi, meiser kagarim. Is it the actual obligation of meiser that causes this din, that at that point I say that the worker can't eat from it? That's not the main point. Gemar melacha kagarim. The main point over here is that we're comparing it to dayish. It doesn't say in the pasuk that once it's chayiv and meiser, now the poil is not allowed to eat from it. We compare it to dayish, which means that it's a time of dayish when it's not yet chayiv, it's not yet prepared and finished to eat from it, to use it. That's what we're comparing it to, but it doesn't matter if it's actually chayiv in meiser or not. So even in the 14 years where it wasn't actually chayiv in meiser, but if it's already prepared to eat, and it would be chayiv in meiser, it should be considered to be gemar malacha, and therefore it's not compared to dayish. So the time period of whether the actual chayiv meiser applies or not doesn't really matter. So therefore the Gemara doesn't accept this answer either. So Elo Amar Ravina, so therefore instead Ravina says, Kroich v'tani, these two brises that we just had. One said meiser, and the other one said chala. It's not two separate brises. You have to learn these two brises together. And you learn it as follows. That dayish, we learn out from the word dayish that the Torah says. Ma dayish miyuchad, just like the threshing, is unique in the sense that it's a davash, ole nigmar malachtoi lemeiser ulachala. That's something that its work is not yet done, not for meiser and not for chala. And the worker can eat from it. If it's something that the work is not done, not for meiser, not for chala, a poil can eat from it. So we put it together. Now what we're gaining with this answer here is, Rashi explains, the point here is that when you look at the product, whether the poil can eat from it or not, you look at the later stage that's possible to look at to say that until that point you could eat. So when it comes to the produce, there's two stages you can look at it. You could either say at the time when it's chayiv and meiser, that's the stage that is considered to be a finished product, and until then you could eat, and not any later than that. Or you could look at a later stage, when it's already a dough, when it's chayiv and challah. That's considered to be a finished product, and until then you could eat. So what the Brisa is saying is, if it's something that's chayiv and meiser, so then if it's chayiv in both actually, if it's chayiv in meiser and challah, I go according to the later stage of challah. That's considered to be a finished product. But if it's only chayiv in meiser and it's not chayiv in challah, then I go according to the earlier stage of it being defined as a finished product. The point is, I always go according to the later stage of it being defined as a finished product. So it depends. If it's chayiv in meiser and challah, the later stage is challah. If it's chayiv only in meiser, so then meiser is considered to be the stage when it's a finished product.
Excuse me, can I ask you? What was the difference between the two groups of 7 years?
They conquered the land, and then they divided the land when they came into Eretz Yisrael. Those are the 14 years. The first 14 years, Yidden war in Eretz Yisrael.
So why was there such a big effect on this or that?
Then they were chayiv in meiser and not in challah, and not in meiser in that time period. The Gemara has another shaila now regarding the worker that works in the field. So one of the things we learned before about the worker in the field is that he's allowed to take from the fruits or from the produce and eat it, but he's not allowed to eat it with other ingredients and season it and so on, just to eat it plain as is. So this the shaila was asked, Poyel, this worker, Ma'oshi Yahavev Bo'or. If he wants to take, let's say, the kernels that he eats and he wants to singe it a little bit in the fire to give it a better taste, is that allowed? For yoichel to eat it. Doing that, is it compared to taking the grapes and dipping the grapes into something else to make it sweet, and that's not allowed? Or over here, it's not the same thing because you're still eating the kernels as is. You're not adding any other ingredients. You're just singeing it in the fire. That's the question. Toshima, so the Gemara says, let's bring a raya. The Braisa says, Rashoy balabayis lahashkes payalim yayin. If a balabas, he has the workers, he wants to take away their appetite from eating from the grapes that they're picking in the field, so he's allowed to give them to drink wine. So they shouldn't have such an appetite to eat from the grapes. So he's allowed to do that. On the other hand, the workers are allowed to do something to make a bigger appetite. The workers, they're eating a snack and they're eating bread. They can dip the bread into a sauce that gives them a sharp taste in their mouth. And this will actually strengthen their appetite to eat even more grapes. So the Gemara here is saying now, thinking that you can prove from this Braisa that you see that a worker is allowed to do something to make a stronger appetite. So maybe we could say it's the same thing also regarding taking the kernels and singeing it in fire and having a better appetite to eat it. It shouldn't just be dry. And so you're allowed to do that. So the Gemara says, no, you can't compare. It's no raya to the question that we're talking about. If it's the person that's doing something to make a better appetite, that's not a question. He's allowed. The question over here is when you're actually doing something to the fruit itself or to the kernels itself that you're singeing into the fire, is that allowed or not? So Tashma, the Gemara says, let's bring a raya from this brayser. It says, the workers, they're allowed to eat the grapes from the best quality grapes. You have the row of grapes, and then you have the top of the row where they get the most sun. And those are the best grapes. So the workers are allowed to eat grapes. So you think maybe the workers should eat from the bad quality. The best quality they should keep for the owner. No, they're allowed to taste and take from the best quality of grapes. But they should not singe it in fire and to give it any better taste. So here you have a clear brayso that says they're not allowed to do this. And says the Gemara, that's not a raya to the shaila we have. Because Hasam mishum bittul melacha. There, the reason the Braisa says they're not allowed to do it is because they're going to do that during the time that they're working. They're taking off from their work to do this. So that's why it's not allowed. Ki kami bayalon. The shaila we had over here is when the person is doing the work in the field and he has his wife and children there on the side and they can singe it for him in the fire and he's not going to have to take up any time from the work to do this. So then the question still applies: are you allowed to do this? Tashema, the Gemara brings a raya from another brayso where it seems to say clearly here, lo yahaviv bu'ur. You're not allowed to singe in the fire, and v'yochal to eat from the produce. V'lo yichmar ba'adama, and you also can't take anything and then bury it or hide it in the earth, and that's something that's not fully ripe, and you want to bury it that it should be a little warmer and get riper. V'yochal to eat. And also, v'lo yafrich al gabe yasela. You shouldn't take fruit that you pick from the tree and then bang it on a rack. V'yochal to eat from it. Aval mafrich al yad. If he wants to bang it open in his hands, you're allowed to break it apart into small pieces to eat. And you eat it. So here, the Braisa clearly says that a person is not allowed to singe it in the fire and eat. So again, the Gemara says, like we said before, Hasam mishom bittul melacha. Over there, this Braisa is saying that you're not allowed to do any of these things because this takes time to do and you're taking off from your work. When you're picking it apart in your hands, so it doesn't take off from the time of your work, so that's why it's allowed. Says the Gemara, it's logical to say that that's what the Braisa here is saying. If the Braisa here is saying that don't singe it in the fire or don't hide it in the earth to warm it up, if all of the point of it here is that you're just allowed to eat it plain, you're not allowed to eat it and trying to add taste to it by singeing it in the fire, that's the point. So then, when it said that don't break apart the fruit on a rack, it doesn't sweeten the fruit at all by this. It's just that something that it takes more time to open the fruit, and therefore it says do it by hand and not on a rack because you're taking off from time from work. So the Gemara answers and says, no, this raya that we're bringing is actually not a raya. When a person bangs the fruit on the rack, so it does bring out the juice, it does sweeten the fruit a little, and therefore we could still say that what the Braisa here is talking about is that a person shouldn't do any of these things because he's sweetening the fruits that he's eating. So therefore, that's not a raya. But nevertheless, we don't have a raya here from this brisa because it could be that the pshat in the brisa is that he's not allowed to do any of these things because it takes off from the time of his work. Tashama, the Gemara tries to bring a raya from another brisa. Poyalin shayu oidrim b'te'enim. The poyalin workers that are cutting figs. Some are actually goyres, not oidrim. Oidrim is not usually a term for cutting. Some are goyres. The word oire by te'enim, by figs, it's usually the term for cutting is oire. Or v'goydrim b'tamarim. They were cutting dates, or beitzrim manovim were cutting grapes, or meiskim bezeisim cutting olives. This is unique in Lashon Kodesh when it comes to all these different kinds of trees. There's a different expression of cutting for each one of them. Harei lo eichlim, they can eat from it, upeturim, and they're pater from meiser as well. Shatayre zichsalem, the Torah gave it to them, it belongs to them, they can eat without meiser. In other words, the point there is, like we learned before in Daf Peches, they're not considered to be like a lekeach, that you bought it, and once you buy it, so therefore you'd have to give meiser. It's just that the Torah allows them to eat from it, and they don't have to separate meiser. Bipitom lo yoichlu, with their bread they shouldn't eat. Ela amkei notlu rishus mi balabayis, only if they got a special permission from the balabas. Okay, so in other words, that they shouldn't, if they eat it together with their bread, they end up eating more, so therefore for that they need a special permission from the balabas. And also, they shouldn't eat it and dip it in salt and eat like that. Okay, so now the Gemara thinks that if it says here that they're not allowed to dip in salt, so similar we could say regarding the shaila we have here, are you allowed to take any fruits or any produce and singe it in fire to sweeten it? So if it says here you're not allowed to put it into to salt it, so similar you're not allowed to singe it in fire either. But the Gemara says there's no raya from here. Melach vaday ka'anovim v'dover acher dami. If you're dipping it into salt, that's definitely like a person that takes grapes and sweetens it with something else. That's not allowed. But over here, our question is, he's not dipping it into salt, he's not adding anything. He's just singeing it with a little fire. So that question still remains a question. Okay, now the Gemara is not really going to resolve that question, but here the Gemara goes off now to ask regarding what it just mentioned there regarding the salt. It said that he should not dip it into salt. So the Gemara asks him that, you should not dip into salt and eat. I'll ask you from what it says in a different brayse. Person hired a worker, that he's digging in the earth, or his lakashkish means when the roots of the tree get uncovered and you have to cover them, that it should grow properly. So under an olive tree, that's the work that he's doing. He shouldn't eat. This is like we learned before, because this is not yet when you're cutting from the tree. It has to be similar to dayish when you cut from the tree. Over here, he's still working with the tree when it's still attached to the tree. Now, sachrei livtzai, but if you hired him to cut, and the livtzai is when you're cutting from grapes, or sachrei limsaik, or he's cutting from the olives, or sachrei lelakit, or to pick from any other produce, harei zaichel upater. So you can eat from it, and he's pater, shahatayre zichsa lahem, because the Torah allowed them and gave them to eat from this, so you can eat from it, and he's pater from maitzer. Now, then the Brisa says something else. Kotzatz, kotzatz means if the balabas that hired them specifically made the condition lachatchila that I'm going to pay you for the work you do, and he also set a certain amount of the fruits that he's allowed to eat. So over here, this is not just them eating because of what the Torah allows a worker to eat while he's doing the work in his field. But here, this is a specific condition that the owner made with them, that he's going to give them a certain percent, a certain amount that they can eat from it. So now the question is, are they allowed to eat from it and not separate meiser? Here they're already like a buyer that's getting paid with this, so they're allowed to eat without meiser. So therefore the Brisa says, over here the halacha is, achas, the Bach takes out the vav. If they're eating one at a time, yoichal, they could eat without meiser. But shtayim, if they're eating two at a time, lo yoichal. Then they're not allowed to eat without separating meiser. And the difference is, as we'll see from the continuation of the Gemara later, that when you eat one at a time, so then this is considered to be a eating without a goyren. By meiser it says that only when you make a goyren, when it's like a finished product in a pile, then you have to separate meiser. But if that's over here by fruits, if it's two at a time, it's considered to be that you gathered fruits and you're not allowed to eat without meiser. But one at a time, you can eat without meiser. Now the Brisa finishes off. V'seifes b'melach v'yoichal. You're allowed to dip into salt and eat. So here, this is the contradiction the Gemara is focusing on. In the previous Brisa it said regarding a worker that he's not allowed to dip into salt and eat. You just have to eat it without salt, plain. Here it says you can dip into salt. Now the Gemara clarifies, when it says here you're allowed to dip into salt, on what case of the Brisa is it referring to? We had here two cases. The pile that works and there was no condition that the balabas made that you can take and eat certain things. And then the last case here, when the balabas made up with him that there's a certain amount that you could take and eat for yourself, it's part of his pay. So ahai, here when it says that he can dip into salt, on what case this is going? If you would say it's going on the last case where it's kotzatz, where the balabas made up with him a certain amount that he can take for himself. Kivin the kotzatz, if this is part of the condition that the balabas is paying him, so he can eat it however he wishes. And only with salt, he can do whatever he wants with it. It's his. So it can't be going on that. Don't you think it's going back on the reisha of the Braise, where it talks about a worker that is allowed to eat like every worker that's allowed to eat from the field? So if so, it's a contradiction to the previous Braise, where it says that a worker is not allowed to dip into salt. Abaye answers that no, our whole assumption that we thought that the Braise, when it's discussing whether he could eat with salt or without salt, that it's discussing over here what a worker is allowed to do regarding this, that he's allowed to eat during his work, and then there's a contradiction whether he's allowed to eat with salt or not. That's not what we're discussing over here. What we're discussing over here is whether he would be allowed to eat with salt without giving meiser. The discussion over here and the difference between the two brises will be regarding whether eating salt is a reason that you should become obligated to separate meiser from it. And therefore Abaye says that whether dipping into salt obligates you for meiser or not, then there's a difference here between the two brises. And loy kashi, it's not a contradiction. Kan ba'oretz. When it's in Eretz Yisrael, so over there, just by dipping it into salt, so then you're eating it because you're dipping it into salt. So then you're showing that this is like a finished thing for you, and you're not just eating it b'derech arai, just tasting something quickly, but you're even seasoning it with salt. So then you're going to be chayav and meiser, even though you're eating one at a time. But because you're dipping it into salt, you'll be chayav and meiser. And kam b'chutz la'aretz. And over here it's talking about the meiser and chutz la'aretz. There are certain countries that are close to Eretz Yisrael that there's a takana that Chazal were obligated in meiser. In certain areas in Meretz Mitzrayim and certain areas near Eretz Yisrael where there's a chiyuv of meiser with the rabbanon. So over there, even when you dip it into salt, you're not going to be chayav and meiser. So the Gemara says, "Ba'aretz in Eretz Yisrael kava sefisa." When you dip it into salt, that's enough to establish that it's food that you're eating, not just stam temporarily, and therefore you're chayav and meiser. B'chutz la'aretz loy kava sefisa. Dipping it into salt, over there, Chachamim were not machmer, and if you're dipping it into salt, you're not going to be chayav and meiser. That's the difference between the two brises regarding the chiyuv of meiser. But Amar Rava asks on this, Mi ikemidi. Is there anything regarding the chiyuv of meiser that there is midrabanan in those countries outside of Eretz Yisrael, the ba'aretz kava sefisa, that you could say that in Eretz Yisrael, if you dip it into salt, it would be chayiv and meiser. Midairaisa, in Eretz Yisrael, it's a chiyuv of meiser midairaisa. Ubechutz la'aretz loy kava sefisa. That outside of Eretz Yisrael, if you dip it into salt, it would not be chayiv and meiser mutter lechatchila, and you could lechatchila eat it without meiser. So as Rashi explains, the basis of the question of the Gemara over here is called the tikkun rabbanon kain deraisa tikkun. When Chachamim instituted meiser in those countries near Eretz Yisrael, the chiyuv of meiser there is similar to in Eretz Yisrael itself. So this distinction of in Eretz Yisrael, out of Eretz Yisrael, Rava doesn't accept this. So hello, Marove. So therefore, Rava says the difference between the two brises regarding dipping into salt is as follows: Bein ba'aretz, bein b'chutz la'aretz. Whether it's a field in Eretz Yisrael or it's outside Eretz Yisrael, the halacha is as follows: Chada loy kava. When you're eating just one at a time, one grape at a time, or one thing at a time, so then it does not establish it to be chayiv and meiser. Again, loy kava sefisa. It's not going to be established for the chiyuv of meiser even if you dip it into salt. Tarti, but if you're eating two at a time, kava sefisa, then it's going to be keveya when you dip it into the salt, because you're eating two of them. Kotzatz, if the balabas made a specific condition with the worker that this is your pay, this is what you're getting. Part of your pay is that you're getting these fruits to eat from what you're working with. So then, bein sofas or bein loy sofas, whether he's dipping it into salt, whether he's not dipping it into salt, achas oichel. If he's eating one at a time, he's allowed to eat without meiser. Shtayim. If he's eating two at a time, lo yoichel. Then he should not eat it without giving meiser. Okay, so the point of here is that in the first brisa, where it said that he should not dip it into salt and eat, what was the first brisa talking about? When he's eating two at a time. if he's eating 2 at a time, so over there, if he dips it into salt, he's not going to be allowed to eat it without meiser. Now, the second brisa, what is it talking about? Loi kotzatz, v'loi sofas. If the balabas did not set this as a pay, so he's not kiveyet for meiser because he's like a person that bought it. And v'loi sofas, and he's not dipping it into salt either. So then, oichel shtayim, you can eat 2 at a time without giving meiser. Sofas, however, if he dips it into salt, achas, oichel, 1 at a time, he's allowed to eat without giving meiser. And that's what the second brisa was talking about. When the second brisa says that he's allowed to dip it into salt without separating meiser, it was talking about when he's eating it 1 at a time. Shtayim, if he's eating it 2 at a time, lo yoichal, then he should not eat it. Va'afagav, the noto the shosmi balabayis, even though he has permission from the balabas to take this and to eat it and to dip it into salt. But the itbuluhu lemeiser, because it becomes tevel for meiser, v'kova sefisa. It's once he's eating 2 at a time and he dips it into salt, then it becomes established from meiser and he has to separate the meiser from it. So basically, the point of what Rav is saying is the difference between the first brisa and the second brisa is in the first brisa it's talking about when he's eating 2 at a time. So over there, if he dips it into salt, it'll be chayiv and meiser. And the second brisa is talking about when he's eating 1 at a time. So therefore, even if he dips it into salt, it's going to be potter. Now here the Gemara brings the source of this number. Why, if you eat 2 at a time, is that enough that it makes it chayiv and meiser? The tarti, the kava, sefisa, minalan. If you're eating 2 at a time and you dip it into salt, how do I know that then this is established that it would become chayiv and meiser? Amarav Masne, the Amakra, the pasuk says, ki koftzam ka'amer goyna, that he gathered them together. Gathers 2 together, it's similar to when you gather and create a pile. So you see over here that koftzam, which means as long as you're gathering. When's gathering? When you have 2. When you bring 2 together, that's considered to be gathering. So therefore 2, when you gather together and you dip into salt, that's enough that you're eating something that was gathered and you're chayiv and meiser. But 1 at a time though, even if you dip it into salt, you're not going to be chayiv and meiser.